off by talking about the significance of President Obama declaring Venezuela to be an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States.
Well, I think it's a dramatic escalation and largely an unnecessary escalation of existing tensions between both countries. What is the objective of this? Is the objective here to appease the right in the U.S.?
Looks like the video is just frozen, but let us go for Professor Tinker-Salas, go right ahead.
Yes. Well, I think that what is an unnecessary and dramatic escalation of tensions between both countries. It comes on the heels of the fact that Obama in December of 2014 issued the sanctions. But those sanctions come after the House approved sanctions against Venezuela. So it's been an increase in tensions beginning since the time that Obama announced that he would begin to normalize relations with Cuba. So that on the one hand, we have an effort, theoretically, to normalize relations with Cuba while we maintain an embargo, and on the other hand, to create the image of Venezuela as the new Cuba, as the new country to be sanctioned. So in many ways, it's extremely counterproductive. On the one hand, we're expected to believe it responds to the interest of the U.S., particularly in terms of Obama in addressing the right in the U.S., but the reality is how it's read in Latin America is once again the U.S. And big stick diplomacy. It's read in terms of intervention. And the notion that the U.S. does not support coups is ludicrous on its face. And we have the 2009 coup in Honduras, which you extensively covered, which was very clearly the U.S. was involved. The same thing with Lugo in Paraguay a couple of years later. So obviously the U.S. seeks to increase Venezuela's isolation or to dramatically increase Venezuela's isolation and continue a Bush policy of trying to inoculate Latin America from Venezuela, leading to essentially its own destabilization.
Well, Professor, you've made the comparison or the contrast, really, between U.S. government reaction to alleged human rights violations in Venezuela versus what is happening in Mexico. Could you talk about that?
Well, the U.S. policy falls apart when we talk about that precise example. In the case of Venezuela, the issue is made, and it's again a very condemnable act, the death of 43 people in Venezuela in February of last year during protests. All sides condemn the violence, but in that case, people died on both sides of the political spectrum. In fact, military officers and police were targeted by right-wing protesters. So those actions are condemnable, and again, they merit attention of Venezuela, and they should be prosecuted. But the reality is that in Mexico, 43 students disappeared in Ayotzinapa in the state of Guerrero, and hardly a peep from the U.S. It took weeks for the State Department to actually respond. So we have a duplicitous policy, on the one hand highlighting human rights issues in Venezuela, while on the other hand turning a blind eye to what is really a humanitarian crisis in Mexico, with over 80,000 dead, 40,000 disappeared, and 15 million people being expelled from their own country. So that in that sense, when Latin America looks at U.S. policy, it seems rather duplicitous, and in fact it doesn't hold up and increases the U.S. isolation in the region, particularly if we're considering that in April we're going to have the Summit of the Americas in Panama. If they want to support democracy, I think the best thing the U.S. can do in the case of Venezuela and other countries is to pull back and let things develop on their own. I think you have a very strong opposition in Venezuela. It can speak for itself. You have a government force and other social forces that are organized in those countries. And I think the best thing in the case of Mexico and in the case of Venezuela is for the U.S. to stop intervening.